Great pleasure to welcome you in this last of this year's seminars in the series of the Department of Epidemiology. My name is Bert Hoffman, I'm the chair of Epidemiology, and it is my great pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, Dr. Tyler VanderWeele. We'll talk about the global flourishing study. Dr. VanderWeele is a professor of epidemiology in our Department of Epidemiology, also an affiliate professor in the Department of Biostatistics, and you are the Loeb Professor of Epidemiology. I should mention the whole family in this case. Has worked very much on various epidemiologic psychometric methods, and empirically works, and we'll see that, psychiatric and social epidemiology, science of happiness and flourishing. Tyler, wonderful to have you. Great. Looking forward to your seminar on the global flourishing study. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to present today. I will be talking about our global flourishing study, which has been a focus of a lot of my work over the last 7 or so years. I will talk some on the results of the study, but since this is an epidemiology department seminar, I will focus a lot more on the design and methodology and planning than I typically do when I present this work, and would be eager to have your thoughts and your feedback. But I've certainly, as I'll turn to at the end, benefited tremendously from being a member of this department and thinking through these matters of design. I do want to acknowledge partners. This is a joint collaboration between the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, which I direct, and the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor. Data collection carried out by Gallup, and the data is hosted by the Center for Open Science, generously supported by a consortium of 8 funders. The 3 Templeton philanthropies provided the large majority of the support, but several others as well, including the Dave and Carol Myers Foundation, the Fetzer Institute, Paul Foster Family Foundation, Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation, and Wellbeing Trust, in addition to the 3 Templeton philanthropies. So I will provide an overview of the flourishing conceptualization and measure that we've used not just in this study, but in much of our other work as well. I'll then talk about the design of the global flourishing study and our efforts at data collection. I'll go through what motivated our design and analysis plans. I'll provide a brief overview of some of the initial results, talk about the strengths and limitations of the study, and offer a few concluding remarks. More on the conceptualization of the study can be found, of flourishing can be found in this paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. More on the study itself and the initial results in this paper in Nature Mental Health that was published earlier this year. And then we have a whole host of about 70 papers now on the global flourishing study out over the last 6 months that are part of a Nature Springer special collection that they've hosted for the study, in which the European Journal of Epidemiology is participating as well, and our design paper is published there. More on the Human Flourishing Program available on our website. But in terms of trying to think about flourishing, if we turn to our dictionaries, we find definitions like to grow or develop in a healthy, vigorous way from the Oxford English Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin florere, to bloom, blossom, or flower. It's often the word used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition that we've been using is that flourishing is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. So very broad, all-encompassing. Understood this way, flourishing is multi-dimensional. One may be flourishing in some ways, but not others. One may be struggling with health, but feel one has good relationships, for example, or have a sense of meaning, but feels one has to sacrifice some degree of happiness to pursue one's purposes. But it's multi-dimensional. It also constitutes an ideal. It's never something we perfectly achieve in this life. Flourishing, I would say, also includes the context, the communities, the environments in which one lives. Flourishing has a connotation of the environment itself being conducive to the growth of the thing. So if one were to kind of formally contrast well-being and flourishing, I'd say flourishing includes the context, communities, and environments in which one lives. with the Global Flourishing Study, we are looking at those communal elements, but also looking at individual aspects of flourishing or well-being also. Even this is not straightforward to do if it includes all aspects of a person's life, and well-developed understandings of flourishing are likely to vary across traditions, cultures, religions, philosophies. And so we think a good place to begin is what might be held in common across these different understandings of well-being. And so what we would argue is that whatever else flourishing might consist in, it would at least include these following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but the argument's any reasonable understanding of flourishing would include these 5 domains, along with other things as well. And these are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that these exhaust flourishing, but each is a part of it. I think each of these satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we now, with the Global Flourishing Study, have empirical data to support that claim as well. And each is an end in itself. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think these 2 criteria of being universally desired, being an end, can help shape some consensus around what to measure. So as a brief assessment of flourishing, crude assessment of flourishing, we've taken 2 questions in each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing well-being literature, questions that are in fairly widespread use already and that have received some degree of empirical validation. And these 10 questions are as follows. First, in that happiness and life satisfaction domain, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days, from 0 to 10? Self-rated, from 0 completely unsatisfied to 10 completely satisfied. This is perhaps the most widely used well-being question in the literature. It's been used by the OECD in the UK's annual survey. It's been used by Gallup. It's in this year's National Health Interview Survey here in the United States. And then we supplement that with something more effective. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? From 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. Second domain, physical and mental health. These are just standard self-report health questions taken from the U.S. General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health? How would you rate your overall mental health? 0 to 10. Third domain, meaning and activities. First question, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? From 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This, again, is a very widely used question, once again, by the OECD and the UK's annual survey, by many cohort studies as well. We supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. Fourth domain, on character. First item intended in some crude way to try to get at practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. From 0, not at all true of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then second, in some crude way, trying to get at fortitude, moderation. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness assessments. First item, I am content with my friendships and relationships. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree, trying to get at, in some sense, the quantity of relationships. And then second item, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be. Get the quality of those relationships. We typically report results separately across these 5 domains because, as you'll see, the dynamics can be quite different. Sometimes we'll average the 10 questions for a composite measure of flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing more than an average of those 5 more meaningful assessments. We typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. So these 2 questions, drawn from the financial well-being literature, are how often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? From 0, worry all the time, to 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, and housing? Again, we'll typically report this domain separately as well. Sometimes we'll average all 12 questions for a more secure assessment of flourishing, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, as financial resources are arguably means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice in indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. We've embedded this into a number of our studies, and because it's a pretty short assessment across quite a range of domains, a number of cohort studies have been up for incorporating this as well. So this was embedded a couple of years ago in the Nurses' Health Study. It's in the LSPAC study in the UK. It's in the Japanese Aging and Gerontological Epidemiologic study as well. But it also is the basis for our global flourishing study. We have a host of other well-being questions also, which I'll come to, but these 12 questions are also included in this global flourishing study. So this is a study of over 200,000 individuals in 22 different countries, geographically, culturally, religiously diverse countries, on all 6 populated continents, with an intended 5 years of annual data collection, nationally representative sampling within each country. We have individual level panel data over time, so this is in distinction with the Gallup World Poll that's taking a separate cross-sectional study every year. The first wave of data was released in February of 2024, the second wave of data earlier this year in April, and we've nearly completed the third wave of data collection. This is an open access data resource accessible through the Center for Open Science, so if you're interested in taking a look, please do. We hope as many researchers as possible will make use of it. So these are the 22 countries represented here, and constituting about 64% of the world's population. China was not included in wave 1 of the data release. We initially had China in the study following the COVID-19 pandemic. China began restricting data collection by or for foreign entities. Just about as we were finishing wave 1 of data collection, China said, okay, well, you can come in now. So we quickly moved into the field in early 2024 for the first wave of data, and then the second wave of data collected in China at the end of 2024. So that data is now available, but was not in the first wave of papers. But with China, we're at roughly 64% of the world's population. But again, all 6 populated continents, all the major world religions represented here, and countries ranging from low middle income to high income countries. And so the questions we're trying to ask are, what are the key determinants of human flourishing, and to what extent do they vary by country and by context? What is universal? What may be culturally specific? So what are the effects of childhood or family life, religion, community, work, personality, politics, economics, character on various aspects of flourishing? The first wave of data collection was itself carried out in 2 parts. First, a recruitment stage, where we also asked a variety of demographic questions, along with a handful of retrospective questions about the participants' childhood experiences and context. And then for those willing to participate, followed up very shortly thereafter, often within a matter of weeks, with some of the online recruitment, sometimes immediately, with a fuller set of questions on this flourishing index, other health and well-being questions, communities on social support, character, personality, religion, spirituality, political, national, economic context, and so on and so forth. There are 109 questions overall in the survey. This is a sampling of the constructs that are present in the survey, typically with only 1 or 2 items per construct. So in many ways, the study is a mile wide and an inch deep. And I think some of the criticisms, reasonable criticisms of the study is on many of these constructs, one would ideally like a 10-item or 20-item assessment. Our aim here, especially given the sample size, was to cover as much as we could, but to take often very brief assessments of each of these various constructs. We worked with a panel of experts on each of these to try to identify items which were generally strongly correlated with a whole scale, and also from prior longitudinal studies had relatively strong predictive power. So those were kind of the 2 criteria that shaped item selection. After an initial construction of the survey, we did release it for open feedback over several months. Back in 2020, we received responses from 160 scholars around the world, which led to modifications of about a third of the items, some deletions, some additions, some modifications, and then some further modifications were made in the process of piloting it and translating it into over 40 languages. And all of that material is likewise available online. But a host of questions, not just on that flourishing index, but others on other aspects of well-being, optimism, freedom, peace, balance, mastery, and so on and so forth. Number of health questions, self-rated physical and mental health, but also standard questions on health limitations, pain, single item on PTSD. We do have the PHQ-4 for depression and anxiety, one of the few fully validated scales. So 2 questions each on depression and anxiety, self-reported smoking, drinking, exercise, reported suffering, a host of financial and economic indicators, because this was funded largely by the Templeton Philanthropies, quite a large number of items on religion and spirituality, and then quite a few on relationships and community, along with questions on political voice, government approval, and discrimination, and so on. We were able to ask most questions in most countries. A lot of the government approval questions we could not ask in China. And there were occasionally questions which we weren't able to ask. Some countries generally do not support collecting data on race, so I think we have race, ethnicity in 19 of the 22 countries. But most of these questions are asked in all 22 countries. From wave 1, these are the sample sizes across the different countries. We were generally aiming at a sample of 5 to 10,000 per country. The United States is much larger because this was the one place where Gallup did have an existing panel survey already, which we were able to make use of. In some countries, recruitment and retention worked much better than anticipated, so we have larger sample sizes. In other countries, it was extremely difficult. Turkey, for example, had relatively low response rates overall. So there is quite a bit of variation, but again, most countries falling within 5 to 10,000 participants. It was quite an undertaking insofar as we were dealing with earthquakes in Turkey, political unrest in Egypt, failed call centers in Argentina, in Brazil, new cell phone blocking systems in the UK, Germany, and Spain. Russia and Ukraine were initially 2 of the countries which we eventually had to pivot away from, which added Sweden and Australia. So every week seemed to present new challenges, but we did end up with over 200,000 participants. Had lots of time to think through what these analyses were going to look like, and so we have a research team of about 40 people at the programs at Harvard and Baylor, along with affiliates, working on this data in a series of coordinated analyses. And so the idea was that each researcher would take one construct. Someone might take hope, and another person happiness, and another person income, and another person discrimination, and another person meaning in life. Try to go through the existing global literature on these topics, but then lead a series of papers. So in the first wave of data, one of those papers was just purely descriptive. How is forgiveness distributed across these 22 countries? What about across different demographic groups? How do those demographic relations vary across the 22 countries, and so on and so forth? And then the next person would complete identical analyses, but changing the construct to income, or to hope, or to education, or to self-rated health, or to depression. And the idea is that we would do this every year. So in the first year, each researcher wrote 2 papers, one on the demographic distribution and another on how the childhood predictors, the childhood retrospective assessments, were multivariately related to the outcome of interest. So how the childhood health, or childhood socioeconomic status, or relationship with parents, or experiences of abuse, or feeling like an outsider, how does this relate to happiness in adulthood, or next person income in adulthood? And again, how do those relations themselves vary across the 22 countries? With wave 2, we're then looking at kind of longitudinal predictions 1 year out of each of the outcomes. With wave 3, which I think is really when we can begin to try to make causal claims, we'll be able to look at wave 2 predictors of wave 3 outcomes, controlling for everything under the sun in wave 1. And so we'll be looking at how each of the potential exposures at wave 2 is related to the whole set of outcomes at wave 3, controlling for everything at wave 1. So again, each member of the research team will write a paper with regard to their focal predictor. Waves 4 and 5 will move on to mediation analyses, marginal structural models, and so on and so forth. In each of these papers, there's approximately 200 pages of tables, because we are reporting separately across these 22 countries. In many cases, the dynamics really do vary by country. And most of the primary papers, we are reporting a meta-analytic summary across the 22 countries using a random effects meta-analysis. Essentially treating this as a distribution of countries, a distribution of effect sizes, which we are trying to characterize, but which are reported in full in the online supplement. We do, as a sensitivity analysis, also report country population weighted meta-analyses. It's still up, okay. Which in some ways is more reflective of what's taking place at least in these 22 countries, representing 64% of the population around the globe. But then those analyses are strongly weighted towards, in wave 1, India, with its billion people, and then wave 2 going forward, India and China. So, a lot of those population-weighted results are really reflective of what's taking place in those two countries. So in the demographic analyses, we're just reporting descriptive statistics on age, gender, marital status, employment, religious service attendance, education, migration, doing that meta-analytically, and then at the country level in online supplements for race, ethnicity, and religious affiliation. The assessments themselves do vary by country, so we're not able to carry out meta-analysis, but those are reported at the country level in the online supplements. We then report ordered means of the underlying construct, whether that's happiness, or forgiveness, or income, or self-rated health, or depression, along with 95% confidence intervals and Gini coefficients. And then we provide descriptive statistics by demographic group. One of the interesting things with this project has been the Nature Springer series of journals agreed to do a joint methods review. So all 50 papers looking at these demographic relations had a common methods review. And once that went through various iterations and was approved, the reviewers for each of the individual papers were told all the methods have already been reviewed, just focus on the framing, the introduction, the results, and their interpretation and implication. So far as I'm aware, this is unique, but maybe I'm wrong. But the Nature editors were quite keen to give this a go, and I think it worked fairly well, and also allowed us to keep consistent methodology across these papers, so that the comparisons across different constructs, whether that was self-reported health or meaning in life, you knew were due to the construct themselves, not because of differences in methods. So that was the case both for the demographic analyses and for these childhood predictor analyses, where we, in these papers, reported the means and standard deviations of each of the childhood predictors, and then fit a single multivariate regression on the construct indicator outcome of interest in that paper. So regress happiness, for example, on age, gender, race, ethnicity, religious affiliation at age 12, marital status of parents at age 12, relationship with mother and father, whether the participant as a child felt like an outsider growing up, whether they had experienced abuse, which we were able to ask in all countries except Israel, religious service attendance at age 12, self-rated health growing up, and the subjective SES of family growing up. These are retrospective assessments, and so subject to potential recall bias, but we believe these are in some sense creating a synthetic longitudinal study where we're controlling for a host of other variables at age 12 and looking at relations with a subsequent outcome. So arguing that these provide some, though perhaps weak, evidence for causality, again, subject to potential recall bias, but also reporting e-values for potential unmeasured confounding to assess the robustness of these relationships. But again, looking at this for each and every outcome in this series of papers. And most of those, not all of those, but most of those are now published in the special collection. I'm going to present a high-level description of just the results for composite flourishing, which was what was presented in the flagship paper. Obviously, I can't go through 70 papers today, but more detail online. And this will give you at least a flavor for what the results elsewhere look like. If we average over the responses of those 12 indicators and simply order the means across countries, results might not be what would have anticipated. At the top, we find Indonesia, followed by Israel, Philippines, Mexico, and Poland, all reporting 7.5 or above on average across those 12 questions. Most of the countries, numbers 9 through 20, all report right around 7. They're essentially all, 9 through 20, are all between 6.8 and 7.2, and we really probably shouldn't make too much of these differences given this is subject to translation, differences in interpretation, and so on and so forth. But there are a couple of outliers. Turkey and Japan report especially low here. There is some evidence that in some Eastern cultures, perhaps especially Japan, there can be interpretative preferences towards reporting towards the middle of a 0 to 10 scale, which may have come into play here. That's clearly not all that is going on, because often when we ask binary questions, do you have a close friend to share things with, yes or no, Japan also reports the lowest of all 22 countries on a whole host of indicators. So again, the bias towards reporting in the middle probably does come into play, but there's more than that taking place here. And a lot of this is because of the averaging over those 12 questions, which I will come back to in due course, because the relations do really vary across these different aspects of flourishing. Some of the patterns in the main demographic analyses is that when we average over all 22 countries in meta-analysis, flourishing tends to be increasing with age. This is in contrast with some earlier work on well-being focused mostly on life satisfaction and happiness, which had suggested U-shaped patterns, with older people and younger people tending to report higher levels of well-being, and those in midlife perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and career challenges typically reporting lower. What's seems to be happening in a number of countries, including the United States, over time is that left part of the U has been flattening. Young people are not doing as well as they used to be. And that's the case not just with this overall flourishing assessment, but with individual life satisfaction measures as well. That's the case not just in the United States, but also in Argentina and Australia and Brazil and the United Kingdom and so on and so forth. It's not the case everywhere. In Poland and Tanzania, for example, one finds flourishing decreasing in age. Averaged over the 12 questions and the meta-analysis over the 22 countries, the gender differences are pretty small between men and women, but this does vary by country. In Japan, women report considerably higher flourishing than men. In Brazil, it's the reverse. Men report considerably higher flourishing than women. Replicating a lot of prior work, flourishing tends to be reported higher amongst married individuals, but not in all countries. Single individuals report higher levels of flourishing in India and in Tanzania. Again, creating news for research with regard to why this might be so. Unsurprisingly, flourishing is reported higher amongst employed and self-employed compared to unemployed. Flourishing tends to increase in education, but once again, not everywhere. In Australia and Hong Kong, the pattern is reversed, where flourishing tends to be decreasing in education. Again, opening questions as to why this might be so for subsequent years of research. And then, again, replicating a great deal of research, but now in a broader range of contexts, those attending religious services or with other forms of community engagement tend to report higher levels of flourishing. Just to give you a sense as to what the results look like, these are meta-analytic estimates over the 22 countries for flourishing by age. You can see things are fairly flat through age 40 and then increase thereafter up into the 80s overall. This does disguise a lot of cross-cultural variation. So if we were to plot age and flourishing across countries, the flourishing is in blue, the composite flourishing measure. more standard single-item life evaluation and life satisfaction questions in red and green, respectively. Most of the time, the patterns are similar. When there are differences in absolute level, it's that life evaluation measure that tends to be lower, especially in developing countries, and I'll come back to this point as well. This is the one question that, for example, the World Happiness Report uses, but again, you'll see in many countries, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Germany, Japan, flourishing tends to be increasing with age, United Kingdom, United States. India still, reports a more traditional U-shaped pattern. In Egypt, it tends to be flat, except for life evaluation, which tends to be more U-shaped. So again, the patterns do vary somewhat across countries. With regard to very high-level summary of the childhood predictor analyses, a lot of the high-level main results really are not so surprising, though some of the country-specific results are, which I'll come to a little bit later. But overall, there's higher flourishing reported by those who in childhood had good relationships with their mother and father, those who had comfortable subjective financial status versus those who found it difficult, those who had excellent versus poor self-rated health in childhood, those who were regularly attending religious services, lower flourishing for those whose parents were never married, or possibly those who had a parent die or divorce, those who experienced abuse or felt like an outsider growing up. But there are exceptions, which I'll turn to in a little bit. There's also quite a bit of variation in effect size across countries. So, for example, if one looks at those synthetic longitudinal associations between religious service attendance, say, and composite flourishing, controlling for all the other childhood predictors, one finds for those attending less than once a month, a 0.1 mean higher flourishing, for those 1 to 3 times a month, 0.21 higher, for those at least weekly, 0.26 higher. But the relationship's quite different, from pretty much null to much larger effect sizes of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, with no clear pattern necessarily as to where one's observing the larger effect sizes. Here we find it Poland, Japan, Turkey, Hong Kong. So areas where religious participation is very high, and also areas where it's very low overall. So again, a lot of these questions of why we are seeing this cross-cultural variation, or why we're seeing differences across outcomes, is being left for our research in subsequent years. This first wave was really just trying to get the main results out and describe what is taking place. So again, a lot of the patterns do follow what we're seeing with flourishing, but there are exceptions across countries. There are also exceptions across constructs. For example, with self-rated physical health, we see a lot of the same patterns as with flourishing, except with age. Physical health, meta-analytically, perhaps unsurprisingly, is declining with age. But not everywhere. The United States, strikingly, is one of 2 countries where physical health, self-rated physical health, is reported as increasing with age. Young people feel that they are not physically healthy. So again, differences across constructs, differences across countries. So a lot of this replicates patterns in the well-being literature, but with a richer set of well-being or flourishing assessments, and also a much broader range of countries. But a lot of the patterns with employment, marital status, education, religion were documented, at least in the West, with life satisfaction. And the demographic analyses are intended to be purely descriptive, not causal. The childhood predictor analyses are intended to provide at least some tentative evidence for causality, but once again, potentially subject to recall bias. And so in subsequent work, we're trying to understand better these cross-cultural mechanisms. In terms of kind of big picture takeaways, there's a lot more in each individual paper, but with regard to big picture takeaways, I do think one is this relation with age, which has changed over time, and to my mind has changed in disturbing ways. Young people seem to not be doing as well as they used to be. And so questions as to what can be done to support the well-being of young people. I think also important questions with regard to, is this change in the patterns with age, is this a newly patterned age effect where because of societal structures, people do tend to do better and better as they get older? Or is this a cohort effect, so that For the young people today, they will perhaps over the course of their lives still experience a U-shaped pattern and will get worse over the years ahead. So I think that is still to be determined, and perhaps not something that's deterministically fixed either, something that really depends on how we as a society respond. Second big picture takeaway, I would say, is that flourishing really is multidimensional. Different countries are flourishing in different ways. We tend to find higher levels of financial security and life evaluation overall in richer developed countries than in middle-income countries. But the reverse is the case when we turn to questions of meaning in life, or pro-social orientation and character, or quality of relationships. Those tend to be reported higher in middle-income countries than in high-income countries. The relationship between, fairly descriptive, but the relationship between GDP per capita and meaning in life is negative. And we see this play out in fairly dramatic ways in the data. If you've seen the World Happiness Report statistics, they use only a single question on overall life evaluation, and typically the Scandinavian countries are towards the top of that. And sure enough, if you use our life evaluation question, which is the same as the World Happiness Report's one, and use this data, Sweden is the second highest of the 22 countries. If you instead look at meaning in life, Sweden is 19th out of the 22. So those means earlier are largely reflective of higher levels of meaning in life, of relationship quality, and of orientation towards others that one finding in middle-income countries. So I think this raises important questions with regard to how can we carry out economic development, which is, of course, critical and important in ways that don't compromise meaning and purpose, relationships, or pro-social or orientation. And so if I were to point to one takeaway and one open question that these data give rise to, this is what I think we should wrestle with. What should Indonesia do from here? Is Sweden really the ideal that all societies should be striving for? And then third, I think, takeaway somewhat related to the first is that religious service attendance was one of the most consistently associated exposures, at least with the childhood predictors, with well-being across countries and across outcomes. And I think there's a question as to whether those lower levels of the more humanistic or eudaimonic levels of well-being with regard to meaning, relationships, character of more economically advanced nations is due to declining religiosity in these countries. It is striking that the one high-income country towards the top of the composite flourishing chart was Israel, which has relatively high levels of religious participation. That data was collected prior to October 7th, but again, I think this raises questions whether we need to reconsider and support spiritual pathways to well-being. And then lastly, I'd say one interesting open question and an area of further inquiry where there were some lot of striking and surprising associations, sometimes in particular countries, sometimes with particular outcomes, is the relationship between adversity and subsequent flourishing. And overall, we saw adverse socioeconomic status or experiences of abuse or feeling like an outsider growing up were all related to lower levels of composite flourishing. But with some outcomes, there were differences. More adverse socioeconomic circumstances were related in Israel and South Africa to lower levels of adult pain. Is this suggestive of some mechanism of resilience? In the United States and Argentina, more adverse socioeconomic circumstances in childhood was related to higher levels of meaning in life later on. Quite strikingly, while childhood abuse, feeling like an outsider, was negatively associated with a whole host of outcomes, it was also associated with higher levels of all of the helping behaviors, of adult volunteering, of charitable giving, of helping others, and yet lower levels of self-reported showing love and care to others. So what do we make of these associations? And one paper, which was just recently accepted, also higher levels of experiences of beauty in adulthood. So what are we to make of this? Under what conditions, what responses to adversity lead to growth versus further decline, which is unquestionably the general pattern? we should do what we can to eliminate and reduce suffering. When that's not possible, what can we do to transform it? What are the limitations of these approaches? So this is some of what we hope to work on going forward as well. Strengths of the study: large sample size, diverse range of countries, nationally representative sampling, longitudinal panel data collection, and a fairly wide range of constructs. Some of the weaknesses in the study design itself are most of the assessments of these constructs involve only one or two indicators. Assuming we do get to wave 5, contingent on funding, it's still a relatively limited follow-up. Various aspects of well-being may take a long time to play out. So we hope to keep this study going. We'll see how things play out. Attrition was very much a concern in the study, especially across the range of countries. We did manage in wave 2 to have a retention rate of about 62%, which certainly isn't perfect, but given the range of countries, I think reasonably good, though a lot of variation across countries. It looks like with wave 3 we'll be coming in around 54%, so as is often the case, the largest fall between wave 1 and wave 2, but certainly these can introduce biases as well. We are following up all individuals who participated in wave 1 and subsequent waves, regardless of whether they participated in wave 2 or not, which also affected some of our analytic decisions to use, say, multiple imputation from the beginning. Even wave 1, where we really didn't need it, we employed this so that we could use those individuals who participated, say, in waves 1 and 3, but not wave 2. And then maybe a strength and weakness is the same questions across cultures. This allows us to do a bit more of that cross-cultural comparison, though all of that needs to be treated with a grain of salt given issues of translation and interpretation. But what's most relevant to a given country or culture may well be neglected here because we have used the same questions across cultures. We did try to get global feedback on the questionnaire that did shape the questionnaire itself, but it is unquestionably heavily influenced by Western perspectives on well-being. We have worked with the Japanese Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation to try to incorporate more Eastern understandings of well-being that led to inclusion of questions on balance, peace, and harmony, which, while I think universally desired, are perhaps more valued, or more emphasis is placed in Eastern context. So we hope over time, possibly in a second iteration of the Global Flourishing Study, GFS 2.0, to potentially do more tailored questions to each country. But it was quite an effort to get this off the ground, and so a decision was made fairly early on to keep the questions uniform. Some of the analysis strengths, in addition to the large sample size and diverse range of countries, were relatively low levels of missing data at the individual respondent level, consistent methodology, use of sensitivity analysis. But again, there are weaknesses here as well. A lot of this reporting is affected by matters of translation. Modes of assessment, telephone versus online, seem to make a difference. Interpretation of items and response scales. Seasonal effects. The data was collected at different seasons in different countries, and we know that that has an effect on responses as well. The retrospective assessments of childhood predictors are, of course, potentially affected by recall bias, and there may well be unmeasured confounding in those childhood predictor analyses. But what we're hoping with the Global Flourishing Study is it would provide foundational knowledge for the promotion of societal flourishing and identification of who needs help, and in what ways may, at the country level, inform targeted interventions, both to specific outcomes and specific groups of people, prevention of adverse childhood experiences that tend to impede flourishing, finding pathways to growth and greater resilience. Again, I think some of the open questions are we sufficiently investing our future in youth, in protection of the environment? What is going to happen to subsequent generations? Second, can we carry out economic development in ways that don't compromise meaning, purpose, relationships, character? And third, are we neglecting or sometimes suppressing potentially powerful spiritual pathways to flourishing? This is an open access resource through the Center for Open Science, so if you're looking for a dissertation topic and some of this is appealing to you, please do access it. Again, the health measures are relatively thin, but we do have self-rated health limitations, and then 2 questions on depression and anxiety each from the PHQ-4. I really do think what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and policies put in place to achieve those aims. And so, to my mind, expanding our vision, our purview in public health to look not just at physical and mental health, but a whole host of matters of well-being, of the health of the person, as the World Health Organization's definition of health puts it, of complete physical, mental, and social well-being would be valuable, and that's what we've been trying to do with the Global Flourishing Study. So again, want to acknowledge the funders, as well as the research teams at Harvard, Baylor, Gallup, the Center for Open Science, my co-principal investigator, Byron Johnson, at Baylor University. And finally, I'd like to thank the Department of Epidemiology. I really don't think this project would have come about had it not been for my time here, my being shaped here, my seeing the power of cohort studies, my experience of working with the nurses' health study data and seeing what was possible, even when a single item was inserted at a given wave with regard to longitudinal analyses, as well as my training here in causal inference and thinking about these matters of evidence, of cohort analyses. And then I think it was really the coming together of those two streams of valuable formation that I've felt here at the school that helped bring this study about. So very grateful for the department's formation in those ways as well. Thank you all for being here and listening, and happy to take comments and questions.
Well, thank you, of course, very, very much for it. I try to keep for the people that are watching. This is really very impressive, an enormous amount of work, first and foremost, very ambitious. 2/3 of the world population represented, 200,000 more than that people involved. Enormous amount of work. It's really very, very impressive, and thank you for this presentation. If you want to have questions or comments, you have to realize it's being recorded. For the first time I say this now, but thank you, and those that in the webinar know it as well. Any questions or comments, please? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Really impressive study. And I was wondering whether you have already compared your findings with the literature and findings on Amartya Sen capability approach literature, which is quite similar, though less focus on happiness and more capability. And the second question is, how do you explain that some countries with higher level of insecurity due to crime or conflict still rank higher rather than other safer countries?
Yeah, so on the first question, we do have some conceptual work relating kind of this flourishing framework to Sen and others' capabilities approach. I tend to think of capabilities as strongly related to the pathways and drivers of flourishing itself. So really, from an epidemiologic perspective, more the exposures than the outcomes, and those capabilities can be used well or poorly. I think the desire to ground well-being in the capabilities themselves comes from a view to not impose what it is that we mean by well-being, and I think it's a reasonable impulse, but I think a way to try to get beyond that is to say, okay, there are going to be disagreements about understandings of and conceptualizations of well-being, but what is it that we might agree on? And can we pursue those outcomes, those ends together? And what I've argued and what we've grounded our work in is I think that consensus is broader than is often taken. We typically think, yes, we can agree on physical health and we can agree on financial resources, so let's promote these. But again, I think it's broader. I think pretty much everyone wants to be happy, to have a sense of meaning in life, to try to be a good person, to have good relationships. These are things I think we can work together to pursue. And so some of what we're trying to do is expand the bounds of that consensus around outcomes, not just pathways or exposures. Now, with regard to the admittedly striking means here, I would say two things. One is that I think it's important to look at both objective and subjective indicators of well-being. So, Japan, which scores very low here, and then again on many other questions, and about half the constructs they self-reported lowest of the 22 countries, also has remarkably low rates of crime, extremely high life expectancy, very high rates of literacy. These things are also very important. But I think we've placed, in my view, too much emphasis on just the objective indicators. Those are important, but so are the subjective indicators. And the fact that we're seeing very high rates of loneliness in Japan, but elsewhere in the West as well, I think is a real cause for concern. I think those things ultimately also do affect, over time, physical health, and I think they are part of the explanation, not all of it, but part of the explanation for the declining life expectancy we saw for several years in the United States. So I think it's important to look at both. Again, what I think is coming out of this is that countries that are more community oriented, that are strongly invested in relationships and in preserving their communities, are reporting higher levels of relational satisfaction, consequently also higher levels of meaning in life and orientation towards others, and that's pretty strongly shaping the means that we're observing. So I think there are real questions. How do we do that in richer developed countries where we no longer need each other in some sense, where our economic development is sufficient that we can live fairly autonomous lives and often choose to do so, but then at the expense of relationships, of community. And so this is something, from my perspective, we need to figure out. I think the Surgeon General's report in 2023, the Advisory on Loneliness, is a move in that direction, as is the UK's new Minister for Loneliness. So I think these are important steps, but a lot more to be done.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you for your time. I'm curious about your thoughts on threshold formulations of flourishing. So I'm thinking of the work of Cortese, who, as I understand it, defines flourishing not just simply as doing well across a host of measures of well-being, but doing exceedingly well. And I'm wondering what are your thoughts on the utility of this kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be useful for certain purposes and sometimes for reporting. It's nice to be able to say, 32% of this country is flourishing and 10% of this and 50% of that. I think all of those dichotomizations are somewhat artificial, and I would say notion of flourishing is both multidimensional and continuous. But it can be motivating. Marty Seligman, who's often considered the founding figure of the positive psychology movement, sort of says he wants to see 50% of the world flourishing by 2050. And what does that mean if we don't dichotomize? So I think it can be helpful sometimes, but again, I think more nuanced approaches where we are looking at means and more sensitive to the changes over time from a scientific perspective is useful as well. But we are doing some work on kind of what aspects of flourishing and suffering are potentially compatible with one another. When do people report both high flourishing and in some other aspect of life, high levels of suffering? Indonesia and Philippines were towards the top on this flourishing assessment, but levels of self-reported suffering in the Philippines much, much higher than Indonesia. So again, what do we make of these sorts of relationships? So I think there can be utility, but it's always an artificial dichotomization.
Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I can see a lot of possibility for impact. And I just wanted to ask, how do you manage to communicate these results to stakeholders beyond the scientific community and perhaps even to the respondents of the study? Do you have plans about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, we have hosted a number of public-facing events. We've tried to downplay, in fact, the ordering here because, it does it is subject to matters of interpretation and translation. We've typically oriented a lot of our external-facing work towards those 3 high-level results on age, on different types of well-being and flourishing in different countries, and on questions of religion and spirituality. When the flagship paper came out on April 30th, we had 3 New York Times pieces, one essentially on each of these themes. But there's also a lot that is country-specific. I was invited to speak to a group of Indonesian academics and policy makers who were both intrigued that their country had done so well, also a little surprised, and also a little worried. They said, we have real problems in this country which we're trying to address. We don't want complacency. But they also described how people in Indonesia were deeply invested in one another. And when someone called up and said, let's meet for tea, it was, okay, today or tomorrow, not let's look at our calendar for 2 months out. And they said that culture is really powerful and prominent. We also saw one of the strongest relationships between relationship with mother and childhood and subsequent flourishing across the 22 countries. And so they were likewise able to describe how often in Indonesia, a mother will carry their child for nine months. There's almost this continual bond. And again, we saw this play out in the data. So I think some of those qualitative accounts of what's going on and trying to make sense of the data really are valuable as well, both for celebrating the strengths, but also for trying to figure out how to address the challenges and weaknesses as well.